You're crouched in a patch of underbrush somewhere in what will eventually be called Europe, and you're holding a handful of dark purple berries that look exactly like the other dark purple berries you ate yesterday, except these ones might not be those berries and there's no one around to ask, and also nobody has invented the concept of asking yet because language is still basically grunting with commitment. This is weirdly the same feeling you get standing in the cereal aisle trying to decide if the healthy granola is secretly the same sugar bomb as the other granola, except if you guess wrong here, you don't get a stomachache, you get a Darwin Award and a small, unmarked grave. Somehow the answer to how our species solved this problem involves your tongue being a tiny chemistry lab, a rabbit's diet, generational gossip, almonds that used to actively want to kill you, and a Greek guy with a book that was basically an ancient WebMD except occasionally correct, which honestly already puts him ahead of the real WebMD. Nobody covers this because it doesn't have a battle in it. There's no king, there's no map with an X on it. It's just several 100,000 years of humans quietly not dying one meal at a time, which turns out to be one of the most important and least glamorous science projects our species has ever run. And if it had gone slightly worse at any point, you simply would not be here to feel smug about knowing what an avocado is. So let's actually start at the beginning, which is annoyingly not even human yet, because the groundwork was laid by whatever your very, very distant primate ancestors were doing millions of years before anyone had the audacity to invent agriculture, or fire, or complaining. Your tongue has bitter taste receptors, specifically a family of genes called TS2Rs, and humans have around 25 of them, which sounds like a small number until you remember that bitterness in nature is basically evolution's way of slapping a skull and crossbones sticker on something and hoping you can read pictograms. Plants can't run away from predators, so a staggering number of them evolved toxic compounds instead, alkaloids and glycosides and tannins, chemical weapons dressed up as leaves and berries and pretty flowers. And bitterness is very often the flavor of, please stop eating me, I am trying to poison you. This is not a metaphor. This means your ability to make a disgusted face at coffee before you dump 3 sugars into it is a multi-million-year-old survival mechanism doing its job flawlessly on a beverage that, historically speaking, isn't even trying to kill you, which is a genuinely embarrassing amount of evolutionary infrastructure being spent on you not liking kale. Why does this matter for actual humans instead of gremlin ancestors swinging around in trees flinging fruit? Because it means we didn't start this whole poisonous plant identification project from zero. We started with a built-in warning system already installed, like buying a used car that already has the airbags in it, and then we just had to spend the next several 100,000 years fine-tuning that system through extremely high-stakes trial and error, mostly involving people who are no longer with us. And trial and error is putting it politely, because what this actually looked like for early hunter-gatherer humans was something closer to a horror movie with snacks. Anthropologists who study modern foraging societies, along with archaeological evidence of plant residue on ancient tools, suggest early humans used a few overlapping strategies that were essentially controlled crimes against their own digestive systems. One was small quantity testing. Eat a tiny amount of an unfamiliar plant, wait, see if you die a little bit, and if you don't, maybe eat slightly more next time. A system with roughly the risk tolerance of trying a free sample at Costco, except the sample might induce seizures and the Costco employee cannot be held liable. Another strategy, and this one is genuinely clever, was watching what animals ate, because if the local rabbits and birds were chowing down on a berry with no ill effects, it was probably fine for humans too, though this method has a notable flaw, which is that plenty of things are perfectly edible for a bird's digestive system and catastrophically not edible for yours, meaning our ancestors were sometimes taking dietary advice from creatures that can eat holly berries and shrug it off like it's a light snack. There's also strong ethnobotanical evidence that taste testing evolved into an actual stage technique where a plant would be touched to the lips first, then the tongue, then chewed briefly and spit out entirely, each stage a checkpoint before you committed your whole esophagus to the bit, which is essentially the Stone Age version of reading the first paragraph of terms and conditions before deciding whether to keep scrolling, except the terms and conditions here can genuinely stop your heart. And once someone in the group actually did get sick or die from a specific plant, that information didn't just evaporate because a species that has to relearn don't eat that root every single generation through fresh casualties is a species that runs out of people fairly quickly. So the question becomes, how do you take knowledge this hard-won, this genuinely paid for in blood and stomach cramps, and make sure the next person doesn't have to relearn it from a hospital bed that doesn't exist yet? The answer is that humans invented the original save file, which is oral tradition, and this is where the story gets less about chemistry and more about your weird aunt who has extremely specific, seemingly random opinions about food that turn out to be load-bearing. Knowledge about which plants would kill you, which would just make you sick, and which were fine got encoded into stories, songs, taboos, and flat-out rules passed from elder to child, because oral tradition is functionally a several thousand-year-long group chat where nobody's allowed to leave. This is why so many traditional societies have deeply specific, sometimes bizarre sounding food rules and taboos that outsiders historically dismissed as superstition, when in a lot of cases those rules were quietly encoding centuries of hard toxicological data with none of the boring lab equipment to show for it. Take cassava, a root vegetable that's a staple food across parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, which in its raw form contains cyanogenic glycosides, compounds that release actual cyanide when processed by your body, meaning the plant is, chemically speaking, extremely rude. Communities that rely on cassava developed multi-step preparation processes involving peeling, soaking, fermenting, and cooking, sometimes taking days, that reduced the toxins to safe levels, and this knowledge was passed down as tradition and ritual long before anyone had the word cyanogenic or the faintest idea what a glycoside was. That's not folklore being quaint, that's several centuries of dead relatives condensed into a recipe card, and honestly, if your grandmother's cooking instructions are oddly specific about soaking times for absolutely no stated reason, maybe don't skip that step just because it seems old-fashioned. So if oral tradition was already solving this problem reasonably well, why did entire civilizations later decide they needed to write it all down in actual books? Because memory is unreliable and empires are nosy, and once humans started forming large complex societies with trade routes, doctors, and armies that needed to be actively poisoned or actively kept from being poisoned, depending on which side of the war you were standing on, verbal folklore alone wasn't cutting it anymore. Enter written pharmacology, and specifically a Greek physician named Pedanius Dioscorides, who around 60 CE wrote a 5-volume work called De Materia Medica, cataloging roughly 600 plants along with their medicinal and toxic properties, and this thing was used as a primary medical reference in parts of Europe and the Middle East for over 1,500 years, which is an absolutely deranged shelf life for a textbook. Imagine if your college biology notes were still being cited by actual doctors in the year 3500. Dioscorides documented plants like hemlock, the same stuff that reportedly killed Socrates via a state-mandated execution smoothie, and he got a genuinely impressive amount of the underlying pharmacology correct just from careful observation, without a microscope, without germ theory, without so much as a controlled study, just decades of watching what plants did to human bodies and writing it down with real commitment to the bit. Ancient Egyptian, Chinese, and Indian medical traditions were running parallel projects doing essentially the same work, with the Egyptian Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, listing hundreds of remedies and poisons, and Chinese medical texts eventually cataloging toxic herbs alongside their antidotes with almost bureaucratic precision, the kind of filing system you'd expect from a civilization that also invented the imperial exam. And look, some of this medicine also doubled as murder technology, because if you know exactly which plant kills a man slowly and untraceably, you have accidentally also written the world's first assassination manual. So it's worth remembering that toxicology expertise and poisoning expertise have always been the exact same skill set, just pointed in different directions depending on who's writing your paycheck. So once you've got poison knowledge organized into actual books being consulted by actual doctors across multiple continents, what's left to figure out? Quite a lot, actually, because knowing a plant is dangerous and knowing why it's dangerous are two very different levels of understanding, and that gap didn't start closing until humans developed real chemistry, which took an embarrassingly long time given how much time we'd already sunk into almost dying repeatedly. The breakthrough was isolating specific compounds instead of just going, this plant generally bad, avoid. And one of the clearest, weirdest examples is the almond, because wild almonds naturally contain amygdalin, a compound that breaks down into cyanide at levels high enough that eating a handful of raw wild almonds can genuinely be fatal, and yet somehow ancient farmers in the Mediterranean and Near East, starting somewhere around 3000 BCE, selectively bred a genetic mutation that produced sweet, non-toxic almonds, meaning every almond you have ever casually thrown into a trail mix or a smoothie exists because some ancient agricultural nerd noticed one weird tree wasn't trying to kill anyone and decided to aggressively propagate the heck out of it. That's not folklore, that's applied genetics, several thousand years before the word genetics existed, done by someone who almost certainly never got credit and definitely never got a research grant or a plaque. Modern toxicology eventually gave names to the actual villains, alkaloids like the coniine and hemlock, solanine in unripe potatoes and nightshade, atropine and belladonna, compounds that mess with your nervous system with a specificity that would honestly be impressive if it weren't actively trying to stop your heart mid-sentence. And once chemists in the 18th and 19th century started isolating these compounds directly, humans finally had the why to match the ancient don't, turning several 100,000 years of trial and error folk wisdom into something you could finally put a molecular structure to and put in a textbook without a single ghost story attached. Isn't it a little insulting that it took us this long to get formal receipts for something our ancestors had already figured out by simply not dying enough times in a row? Which brings us to now, to your ingredient labels in your food delivery app and your slightly neurotic habit of Googling is safe to eat raw at 11 p.m. For reasons you can't fully articulate, because you are still running the exact same operating system your ancestors were running in that berry patch, just with dramatically better graphics and a much worse attention span. You still have those bitter taste receptors quietly screening your coffee and your beer and your extremely aggressive kale smoothie, silently vetoing things on your behalf the same way they vetoed unripe berries 100,000 years ago. You still rely on inherited knowledge instead of relearning everything from scratch, except now it's printed on a nutrition label instead of whispered by an elder around a fire, and a food recall notice pinging on your phone is structurally the exact same organism as an ancient taboo about a specific root, just with better fonts and a noticeably less compelling narrator. Every almond in your pantry is a several thousand-year-old genetic edit that nobody asked your permission for, but that you benefit from every single day without a second thought. And every time you trust that a grocery store potato won't hurt you, you're leaning on centuries of people figuring out that sunlight turns them green, and that green means solanine, and that solanine means a genuinely miserable night. So next time you're standing in front of some unfamiliar fruit at a market, or side-eyeing a mushroom on a hiking trail like it personally insulted you, or just reading the label on something suspicious in your cabinet from 3 years ago, know that you're doing the exact same fundamental thing that human being crouched in that underbrush was doing, holding an unknown thing, deciding whether to trust it, except you've got a few 100,000 years of dead relatives, ancient Greek doctors, and one very smug almond tree doing the heavy lifting for you now. And honestly, that's about the closest thing to a superpower any of us actually have.